It was supposed to be the perfect night. Dylan and Mia had spent weeks planning their Diddy party, inviting their closest friends to their new rental home on the outskirts of town. The house, a sprawling farmhouse, had stood vacant for years before they moved in. The rent was suspiciously low, but Dylan joked, "It's not haunted, is it?" when they signed the lease. The landlord just smiled and said, "You'll be fine as long as you don't go poking around." That comment lingered in Mia's mind, but she dismissed it. Tonight wasn't the night to dwell on creepy landlords. The house was decorated with string lights. Music played softly in the background, and the smell of freshly baked snacks filled the air. By 9 p.m., the guests started arriving. There were about 20 people in total, laughing, chatting, and exploring the old farmhouse. A few guests commented on the house's eerie charm, the creaking floors, the heavy wooden doors, and the faint smell of something damp. "It's probably just the age of the place," Mia reassured everyone, though she felt uneasy too. As the party gained momentum, one of their friends, Claire, suggested they play a drinking game in the basement. The basement? Mia hesitated. She hadn't spent much time down there. It was dark and cluttered with old furniture and strange odds and ends left by previous tenants. "Come on, it'll be fun," Claire insisted, already heading toward the basement door. Reluctantly, everyone agreed, and they trooped downstairs with drinks and flashlights in hand. The basement was exactly as Mia remembered, dim, cold, and filled with forgotten items. In one corner stood a full-length mirror, its surface cracked and mottled with age. The group gathered around an old wooden table, laughing and joking as they started their game. But as the night wore on, the mood shifted. The air grew colder, and the laughter seemed to echo unnaturally in the confined space. That's when Ben, one of Dylan's co-workers, noticed something odd about the mirror. "Hey, is it just me, or is that reflection off?" he asked, pointing toward it. Everyone turned to look. At first glance, the mirror seemed normal, though its surface was warped and foggy, but as they stared, they noticed something unsettling. The reflections didn't match their movements perfectly. When Claire waved her hand, her reflection lagged behind, almost as if it were deciding whether to follow. "Okay, that's freaky," Mia said, her voice trembling. "Let's go back upstairs." But just as they started to move, the basement door slammed shut upstairs, the sound reverberating through the house. "Dylan?" Mia called out, panic creeping into her voice. "Probably the wind," Dylan said, though his unease was evident. Ben approached the stairs and tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he said, his tone serious. Mia's heart raced. "That door doesn't have a lock." The group began to panic, their flashlights darting around the room. That's when they noticed something else. The mirror's surface had begun to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. From the depths of the glass, a shadowy figure began to emerge. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs elongated and face featureless. The figure pressed its hand against the inside of the mirror, leaving dark, smudged prints on the glass. "What the hell is that?" Claire screamed, backing away. No one had an answer. The shadow seemed to be watching them, its head tilting as if studying their terror. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed at Dylan. "Let's get out of here," Mia shouted, grabbing Dylan's arm. But as they turned to run, The lights flickered and went out completely. The basement was plunged into darkness, save for the pale glow emanating from the mirror. In the chaos, someone knocked over a chair, and Claire screamed again. Mia fumbled with her phone, using its light to guide her. The mirror was now empty, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. "Over here!" Ben shouted, pulling at a small window near the ceiling. "We can climb out." One by one, they scrambled through the narrow opening, clawing at the frozen ground outside. Once everyone was out, they ran to the front yard, gasping for breath. Dylan, the last to climb out, turned to look back at the house. In the living room window, he saw it, the shadowy figure, standing perfectly still, its head tilted toward him. The police arrived after they called from a neighbor's house. The officers searched the house but found no signs of forced entry or anyone inside. However, when they inspected the basement, they discovered something chilling. The mirror had shattered, but behind it was a hidden door. Inside the small room was a single wooden chair, a thick layer of dust covering the floor. On the walls, scratched into the wood, were dozens of names, including Dylan and Mia. Mia and Dylan moved out the next day, leaving most of their belongings behind. They later learned that the farmhouse had been abandoned for decades after a series of disappearances linked to the property. To this day, Mia refuses to talk about what they saw that night. But every so often, Dylan dreams of the shadowy figure, always watching, always waiting, and in his dreams, it whispers one word: soon. It was a Friday night in early winter, and the wind howled against the windows of Lila's house as she prepared for her annual Diddy party. This year, the guest list was smaller, just close friends and a few co-workers. Lila wanted a low-key night filled with food, drinks, and laughter. Her house, an old Victorian-style home, was nestled at the edge of the woods. It had belonged to her grandmother, who'd passed away years ago, and though the house had a quaint charm, Lila often felt uneasy in it. She'd chalked it up to being alone in a large, creaky house and pushed the feeling aside. The party started off wonderfully. People arrived one by one, shaking off the cold and bringing dishes to share. The living room was warm and lively, filled with chatter and soft music. Lila was relieved. This was exactly the vibe she'd hoped for. About 2 hours into the party, as Lila refilled drinks in the kitchen, she noticed a woman standing at the edge of the room. She had long dark hair, was wearing a deep burgundy dress, and was holding a glass of wine. Lila didn't recognize her, but it wasn't unusual for her friends to bring a +1 without mentioning it. Lila smiled and called out, "Hey, I don't think we've met. Who did you come with?" The woman didn't respond. She just smiled faintly and walked toward the dining room. A little unnerved but too busy to dwell on it, Lila went back to tending to her guests. Later, when she had a free moment, she asked her friend Rachel about the woman. Rachel frowned. "What woman?" "The one in the burgundy dress. She was in the kitchen earlier," Lila said, gesturing toward the dining room. Rachel shook her head. "I haven't seen anyone in a burgundy dress." Now Lila was confused. She decided to check the dining room but found it empty. Shrugging it off, she assumed the woman might have gone outside or left early. The night continued, and everyone gathered in the living room for games and drinks. The mood was light, and people were laughing. But Lila couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Every now and then, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. a shadow passing by the doorway or a figure standing at the edge of the room. At one point, her co-worker Jason whispered, "Hey, who's that?" and nodded toward the hallway. Lila turned quickly, her heart pounding, but saw nothing. "What do you mean?" she asked. Jason looked uneasy. "I thought I saw someone standing there. Guess I'm seeing things." The incident unnerved Lila further, but she didn't want to ruin the party, so she kept quiet. Around midnight, the party began to wind down. Guests said their goodbyes, and soon the house was empty. Lila locked the doors, cleaned up a bit, and decided to head to bed. As she climbed the stairs, she felt a sudden chill. The air grew heavy, and the hallway ahead seemed darker than usual. She hurried into her bedroom, locking the door behind her. Just as she was about to turn off the light, her phone buzzed with a notification, a photo her friend Rachel had just uploaded from the party. Curious, Lila opened it. The picture was of the group in the living room, all smiles and laughter. But as Lila examined the photo, her breath caught in her throat. In the background, near the doorway to the hallway, stood the woman in the burgundy dress. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy, and her expression was vacant. Lila stared at the photo, panic rising. She was sure of one thing: the woman wasn't a guest. She decided to call Rachel to confirm. "Did you see the woman in the photo you just posted?" Rachel hesitated. "Yeah. I noticed her after I uploaded it. I thought she was one of your friends. Is she not?" "She's not," Lila whispered, her voice shaking. Just then, there was a soft knock on her bedroom door. Lila froze, her phone slipping from her hands. She turned toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely audible. There was no response, just the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps retreating down the hallway. Lila didn't sleep that night. She stayed locked in her room, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife. The next morning, she checked the locks and every room in the house but found nothing out of place. Yet the feeling of being watched never left her. A week later, Lila found an old family photo album while cleaning. As she flipped through the pages, she froze. There, in a faded black and white photo, was the woman in the burgundy dress. She stood next to Lila's grandmother, wearing the same eerie smile. Written below the photo in neat handwriting was a name: Margaret. Lila later learned that Margaret was her grandmother's sister who had died tragically in the house decades ago. The family rarely spoke of her, as her death was shrouded in mystery. To this day, Lila avoids throwing parties at her house, afraid of inviting Margaret's spirit back into the fold. Guests who visit often mention feeling a chill in the dining room or seeing movement in the corner of their eyes, but no one dares mention the woman in the burgundy dress. It was a cold November evening when Kelly decided to host her first Diddy party in her new apartment. She'd moved in a month earlier and had finally finished unpacking. The apartment was cozy but a little old, with creaky floors and a slightly musty smell she couldn't quite get rid of. Still, it was the perfect space for a small gathering with friends. About 12 people showed up that night, bringing snacks, drinks, and their usual laughter. The mood was light, and Kelly was thrilled to show off her new place. The group especially loved her antique record player, which she'd found at a thrift shop. "Does it work?" one of her friends, Jake, asked. "Yeah, "I've been using it all week," Kelly replied. "It even came with a box of old records." The group decided to pick one of the records to play during the party. Kelly brought out the box, and everyone started sifting through the collection. Most of the records were classic jazz and blues, but one stood out, a plain black sleeve with no label or writing. "Let's play this one," Claire said, holding it up. Kelly hesitated. She hadn't noticed that record before and wasn't sure where it had come from. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Come on, it'll be fun," Claire insisted. Reluctantly, Kelly placed the record on the player and dropped the needle. A soft crackle filled the room, followed by a hauntingly beautiful piano melody. The music was slow and melancholic, unlike anything Kelly had ever heard. At first, everyone was captivated by the strange tune, but as the song continued, a sense of unease began to creep into the room. The melody seemed to grow heavier, almost oppressive, and the air felt colder. "Okay, this is weird," Jake said, shifting uncomfortably. Kelly moved to stop the record, but the needle wouldn't lift. She tugged at it, but it was as if it were glued in place. "That's not normal," Claire muttered. As the song played on, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, so faint that Kelly thought she was imagining them, but soon everyone heard it, soft, unintelligible murmurs coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Turn it off," Jake shouted. "I'm trying," Kelly yelled back, frantically pressing the power button. But the record player wouldn't stop. Suddenly, the melody changed. The once haunting piano now played discordant, jarring notes, as if the instrument were being slammed in frustration. The whispers grew louder, almost like chanting, and the room seemed to tilt, making everyone feel dizzy. "Let's get out of here," Claire said, grabbing her coat. Just as they started heading for the door, the music stopped. The room fell silent, and for a moment, they all froze, listening. Then a voice, low and guttural, spoke from the record player. "Don't leave." The group screamed, scrambling for the door. Kelly fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking, and they all tumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. Once outside, they stood in stunned silence, staring at the closed door. "What the hell was that?" Jake finally asked. Kelly couldn't answer. She looked back at her apartment, now dark and eerily quiet. The group decided to call it a night. Kelly stayed at Claire's place, too afraid to return home. The next day, Kelly went back to the apartment with Jake to collect her things. When they entered, the record player was smashed to pieces on the floor, as if someone, or something, had destroyed it in a rage. They looked through the box of records, but the plain black sleeve was gone. Kelly moved out a week later. She never found out where the record came from, but the neighbors later told her that strange things had happened in the apartment before she moved in. Doors opening and closing on their own, objects disappearing, and faint music playing at night when no one was home. Kelly doesn't host parties anymore, and she avoids anything to do with old records. Sometimes, though, she swears she hears that haunting melody in her dreams, accompanied by a voice that whispers, "Come back." It was a crisp autumn evening in a small suburban town. A group of friends had gathered at Erin's house to celebrate her promotion with what they called a Diddy party. a casual get-together with drinks, music, and laughter. Erin's house was an older colonial-style home, full of creaky wooden floors and dimly lit hallways, which gave it a certain charm and an eerie vibe. The party started off lively. About 15 people mingled in the cozy living room, sipping wine and beer while music played softly in the background. As the night wore on, some guests moved to the backyard, where a small bonfire crackled. Around midnight, Erin decided to share some ghost stories, something they always did at their gatherings. Most stories were humorous or obviously made up, but when it was Erin's turn, her expression grew serious. "I've always felt like this house wasn't empty," she began. The room fell silent. She told them how, on multiple occasions, she had heard footsteps in the attic when no one was home, and how doors would creak open as if someone were standing behind them. Just last week, she'd found her bedroom window wide open, despite locking it before bed. The group laughed nervously, brushing it off as typical old house noises. Someone joked, "Maybe the ghost will join us tonight." At that moment, the lights flickered and the music cut out. The laughter stopped. Everyone stared at each other, trying to gauge if it was a coincidence. Erin laughed nervously and muttered something about the old wiring, then went to check the fuse box. The lights came back on a moment later, but the mood had shifted. One of the guests, a guy named Daniel, suggested they take a group picture to lighten the tension. Everyone crowded together near the fireplace while Erin set up her phone on a timer. The flash went off, and the party resumed. It wasn't until much later, after everyone had gone home, that Erin noticed something odd in the photo. There were 16 people in the picture. She counted again, her pulse quickening. There were only supposed to be 15 guests, including herself. She zoomed in on the stranger, a man standing slightly apart from the group. He was tall, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at her. His clothing looked out of place, like something from decades ago. Her stomach dropped. She didn't recognize him, and she was sure he hadn't been there during the party. The next day, Erin showed the photo to some of her friends. None of them had seen the man either. "Maybe it's just a trick of the light or some glitch," one friend suggested, though their voice wavered. But Erin couldn't shake the feeling that the man had been there, watching them. She started to notice small, unsettling things around the house. A chair slightly out of place. Her keys moved from the counter to the table. Faint whispers when she was alone. The final straw came a week later, when Erin woke up to find the photo from the party lying on her nightstand, despite her keeping it saved only on her phone. The stranger's face was circled in red marker, and beneath it was a single word, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Mine." Erin moved out of the house the following month. To this day, she refuses to talk about what else might have happened in the weeks before she left. The house remains vacant, and neighbors claim they sometimes see a figure standing in the window. A tall man with hollow eyes, waiting for his next party. It was the summer of 2016 when Emily and her college friends attended a Diddy party, hosted by a mutual friend named Andrew. Diddy parties, as they called them, were private gatherings in large old houses where the music was low, the mood was eerie, and everyone dressed in vintage clothing. This time, the party took place in Andrew's newly inherited property, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. The house was beautiful but unsettling, its creaking wooden floors, dim lighting, and towering bookshelves filled the air with an unnatural silence. Andrew greeted everyone at the door, wearing an old-fashioned tuxedo that matched the mansion's 19th century vibe. He looked strangely pale, but Emily brushed it off as part of the ambiance. As the night wore on, Emily noticed something odd. Andrew wasn't mingling with the guests. Instead, he seemed to glide from room to room, always smiling but never speaking. At one point, Emily saw him standing at the far end of the dining hall, staring at her. His lips moved silently, as if whispering, but no sound came out. She turned to call her friend Beth, but when she looked back, Andrew was gone. Later, Emily decided to explore the upper floor. She climbed the grand staircase and walked down a hallway lined with antique portraits. The faces in the paintings seemed to follow her with their hollow eyes. One door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, and inside she found a small room filled with old photographs. One picture caught her eye, a group of people standing outside the mansion. In the center was Andrew, wearing the same tuxedo he had on that night, but the photo was dated 1916. Her stomach churned as she flipped through more photos, each showing Andrew with different groups of people across the decades. His face remained unchanged. A sudden noise behind her made her spin around. Andrew was standing in the doorway, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes seemed darker than before. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a low, gravelly voice. Emily bolted past him, her heart racing. She burst back into the main party area, only to find the room empty. The guests were gone. The only sound was the faint hum of a record player spinning a warped tune. Panicking, she grabbed her phone to call Beth, but her hands froze when she saw her reflection in a nearby mirror. Andrew was standing right behind her, grinning ear to ear. The next thing Emily remembered was waking up outside the mansion, the sun rising in the distance. The house looked abandoned, its windows boarded up. She tried calling her friends, but none of them answered. When she finally reached Beth's parents, they told her Beth had gone missing the night before, along with everyone else at the party. The police found no signs of a gathering at the mansion, and Andrew's name didn't appear in any property records. To this day, Emily avoids parties altogether, haunted by the chilling memory of the silent host.